all of you. I was really worried because I thought she was going to be on a ball, and I thought I'm going to give you cognitive whiplash after that. It was delightful, it was wonderful, and actually I feel like such a wonderful segue into some of the things that I want to talk about too. So thank you for the wonderful presentation. I don't have any cool stuff like this. I guess I'm old school, but I did bring some bubbles. I thought it was just time to do this a little bit. This is going to be relevant, I promise. Anyone want to blow bubbles?
Not yours. Yes. Oh.
Yeah. Anyone want to blow bubbles? You can have them. Here they are. So, if somebody, because I've tried to pack much more than was wise into 18 minutes, if somebody would raise their hand about 15 minutes, I'll shut up too. So I blew the bubbles because bubbles, I think, are a really good metaphor for what I want to talk about tonight, which is abstract, and I'm hoping I can make it land on the ground so you don't leave here saying, what was he talking about? But for the bubbles, watching them in flight, bubbles exist by hanging in suspended flight. They exist in motion, they exist in ever-shifting relation to the subtle movements of the currents of holy wind, to use a Navajo phrase. The bubbles exist by a kind of closure, but it's in that closure that makes light uniquely available, makes light uniquely apparent and visible. Bubbles are inspired structures. We breathe them into existence, and in breathing them into existence, they contain our breath. In containing our breath, they contain us. But in containing us, they also exceed us, they also elude us, they escape us. They become what we are not, what we cannot be. What the trajectory it follows, the differences even just a little bubble makes in the world are differences I can't make by myself. So they go someplace that I can't necessarily predict. Bubbles are transient. They will exist and disappear, and that reminds us, because I'm talking tonight about generative enclosures, and I mean a lot of different things by generative enclosures, any kind of subjective space in which something manifests, and also physical space. Here, by the generative enclosure, I'm looking primarily at our religious traditions, our practice lineages, those special vehicles that push us to modes of transformative living. And so the bubbles in their transiency, bearing this breath and this inspiration, but they're also perishing, they remind us that our lineages too are quivering on the edge of existence, and that they are manifest through the serious leela of bubble play. We have to blow them again and again, generation after generation, into existence, and then it's in those spheres that some kind of transformative potential is made available and enacted by the generations of people who work with the generative enclosures, the lineages that we enact. So I'm going to kind of circle in this talk in a meandering way, like a bubble drifting. I want to touch on a couple different topics on the way to really talking about what the hell I mean by generative enclosure. And so going there, even just to start, I'd like to ask you first just to drop into your awareness and to just become attuned to what is present in the room. What is showing up for you in the circle of your awareness? And then shift your perspective to not dropping it, what you're doing, but also shift it to feel and experience the room from your neighbor's perspective. How is the room showing up for your neighbor? And by neighbor, I also mean these plants. I mean the dust mites in the rug and the spider on the wall over there. I mean the disembodied head of Ken Wilber. Am I the only one who sees them? Any of these things, how does the world show up for you from all those perspectives? And about a century ago, a biologist named Jacob von Uexküll wrote a delightful book. He illustrated a book talking about a walk out in a field. And he was walking in the field and he beheld the different flowers of different colors waving in the afternoon sun, and the tips of grass lit up by the golden rays, and the bees lazily buzzing around, and he drew this picture. But then he toggled his perspective, and he would see the field from the perspective of the bee, and he would see the field from the perspective of the flower. And each time he then drew what he experienced. And he was noticing what is selected, what is deselected, what flows and enticements and energies and objects appear and disappear as you move in and out of these different kinds of perspectives. And so doing that toggling of perspective gave him the sense of contiguous and nested bubbles of experience. Bubbles amidst bubbles amidst bubbles of all these worlds of the bees and of the flowers, overlapping and contiguous, like this kind of teeming space, right? And so the work that the vision, the insight that he came up with out of that gave inspiration to several emergent fields which are now called things like biosemiotics and ontoethology and alien phenomenology and zone 5 inquiry. So these are all these kind of things growing out of that seminal kind of insight there, and developed from other angles too. The concept of bubbles and spheres that I want to talk about now is inspired in part by Uexküll's work, but it's also taken up by a philosopher named Sloterdijk. And so I'm going to talk just a little bit about Sloterdijk's understanding of bubbles too, and what he's doing with this concept. Sloterdijk is like a post-Heideggerian philosopher, and so he is wanting to go the next chapter that Heidegger himself didn't do. Heidegger wrote about being and time, and Sloterdijk wants to write about being in space. And so he's written a trilogy called Spheres, and developed a kind of view called spherology, a philosophy of space and relation and intimacy and becoming. And so he's wanting to kind of shift our whole orientation about what it means to be an individual or to be a being in the world. And he's approaching it through the philosophy of space. Time has been kind of the cool subject in philosophy for a number of decades, and everyone's talking about time, including integral circles. It's always development and evolution, and time is really cool. Space is kind of for old men geometers, you know, just no one pays much attention to space, and he's wanting to kind of like revitalize that, make it back a relevant topic. And so he's, explored the concept of bubble from a number of different perspectives, and I'll kind of go into that leading up to what I mean by generative enclosure, because all of these different things I'm collecting, I want to put all in the basket of generative enclosure. So in Sloterdijk's work, he's done this broad survey of the history of human thought through art and a lot of beautiful photographs, which I wish I was more technical savvy. I can show you all that stuff, but it's really such a rich history of the image of the bubble and the sphere showing up throughout all of our art across many, many centuries. You know, we can think of the Greek nested crystal spheres that can hold the different layers of the cosmos, or the old images of the universe being born out of an egg. You know, and so the egg is another good metaphor for this. So I want to just take a few minutes to just talk about egg space, right? And so an egg is there's a saying which is ex ovo omnia, an old saying, ex ovo omnia, which means everything comes from eggs, everything comes from the egg. And it's an old metaphysical principle, looking back at the old creations, some early creation stories, but also we look around at the world, we can see, birds and snakes, and a lot of creatures come from eggs. We weren't quite sure biologically that we do come from eggs, but now we know. We know that we also are hatched from eggs that are grown in the nurseries of our bodies. But there are more ancient stories of Greece and China, of the emergence from this cosmic egg which birthed the universe. And of course that's the Big Bang. The Big Bang is this tiny egg that bursts, and then it's this expanding sphere of space-time in which all of this stuff is generating and happening. Right? So it's another sphere, it's another bubble. And in the meaning of this, the egg here, you could say, is chaos become cosmos, or cosmic becoming. That's kind of what the egg is standing for, is cosmic becoming, this unfolding process, which is made available by the closure of the shell, of the boundary, that makes a spheric space opens up in which some new potential can emerge in that space that we generate together. Right? And so eggs have a couple phases to them. You know, the first phase is that the eggs are generated by maternal power. The egg is just put into being by the maternal power. And then begins the project of the being that grows within there to self-liberate itself. That the being that arises in this space then has to find a way to move out of that space. And so eggs ask us to think containment or shelter and rupture at the same time, and both as necessary. And so in thinking them both at the same time and as necessary, when we erupt, when we go through our process of self-liberation out of a particular egg, what happens? Do we emerge into the open? Sloterdijk would say, no, we merge into another shelter. And we emerge from shelter into shelter, from space into space. There's never a completely naked open as an embodied being. And so when we emerge from the womb space, then we emerge into the mother-child dyad, for instance. Of course, the ancients would say that we emerge into like already the spiritually ordered world, where there's the underworld, and then there's the middle world, and then there's the, the overworld, the celestial sphere. But also, we still think that way. We emerge into the mother-child dyad, and then into the family, and then into the community, and we emerge from nested sphere to nested sphere. And each time, what is for that womb space the supportive, hidden, implicit background? When we go through that rupture process, that then becomes our lived space. And then there's another supportive background. And so this is the play of subject become object that Wilbur talks about, but manifest in a physical way, or a concrete way to describe and understand that. And so with this, with these spheres, what Sloterdijk wants to say is something a little bit different than maybe we've been thinking. Because if you think about eggs or certain things, we think about a single individual in a bubble or a sphere, or a single individual in an egg. But Sloterdijk insists, and this is one thing that I was resonating with what you were talking about in terms of developing a culture of secure attachments. Right? He insists that this is a myth of the kind of like the individualist modern era human being that has not been around for a long time and probably needs to move past, in higher integrations later. This idea that we are this lone individual, right? Even your body is an intersubjective festival going on. I mean, there are all kinds of beings that are not human doing all kinds of things in you right now, minding their own business and doing their own thing. And your humanness is constituted by their intersubjective play, that they're doing in there. That's making you partly human. So there's always this coming together. But what Sloterdijk would say is even in the womb, the child is accompanied by the placenta. The placenta is like the hidden angel twin that is feeding and connected to the child, and that the child has this partner that's always there, and that they both emerge together. Our culture throws it away. Other cultures had buried it sacredly or hung it in a tree, recognizing that this was a sustaining angel, for the other being, right? And so in this spheric space, it's a dyadic space. And for Sloterdijk, spheres are always dyadic spaces. Then there's the mother-child space in which this new spheric kind of a relationship emerges, new resonances, new attunements, new creative possibilities emerge from that dyadic order and play. And he would argue, moving through, any spheric space that we can talk about, whether it's the family or the culture, the school, the religion, all of them, there's no individual standing alone. And so that's part of also the idea of this bubble existing in suspended flight, that in a way that's talking also about, because in suspended flight it's between points, it's between places, and so the emergence of the individual in the sphere that contains them is happening in this space of between. So Sloterdijk and also another philosopher named Jean-Luc Nancy talk about the word with as the heart of being. And Jean-Luc Nancy would say that the idea of a singular being is a contradiction in terms. And what the phrase that he pronounces is being singular plural. And he always leaves them running together, being singular plural. and that whenever a being shows up, it always shows up singular plural. And I think this is something that Wilber's quadrants testify to, right? This is tetra in action, that there's the singular and the plural always co-arising together, right? And so I think this is just another philosophical way of languaging that kind of tetra in action. So how am I on time? I know I'm up.
3
minutes. So that brings me kind of to want to talk about magic circles. And magic circles, we've long history of magic circles in our cultures, and we've recognized intuitively for thousands of years that something magic happens in these circle spaces, these spheric spaces. Something emerges. We've got the caves that we met in and painted on, and the beautiful film from France in 3D. I can't remember the name. It was so gorgeous of all the images that we painted 30,000 years ago in those cave spaces. And then there's the kivas, and the Bora rings of Australia, and the megalithic stone circles of England and Europe, and the medicine wheels, and the magic circles of the Golden Dawn and Wicca and all the magical traditions, and then there's the mandalas of the tantric, and the Hindu and Buddhist kinds of traditions. We have long sensed that these places, these kind of containers, are places for deep magic. This is where deep magic happens. This is where somehow we call something new into being. They're places of enactment, places of generativity. And so I would like to extend that, metaphorically out to a couple of other places. I mean, we still have these kinds of magic circles that we rely on. We've got them in, the medicine wheel, where you stand in the medicine wheel and you call on a vision, or you are doing certain kinds of practice. When I used to do Bonpo meditation practice, you would always kind of visualize this protective field around you, and that was not only to protect you, but actually to set a space in which the generation practice was going to happen, right? And so there's something about setting that boundary that allows light to show up differently and allows for certain intensities to build. There's a concept of the theory of consciousness that says that consciousness is like phenomenal information, like a ray, and that our structures are structures that can capture that light and magnify it and fold it on itself. And so you could think about generative structures as structures that we build that fold light on itself and allow for this kind of magnification of intensity, right? And so dyad spaces are spaces of intimacy that we meet together, with and that generate new forms of being. And just as an example, think about, because these are dyadic spheres, relational spheres, as generative spheres. Think about the human face. I'd like to ask you, if you're not shy to do so, to look at the person next to you and behold them, behold their face. And over the long history of our evolutionary emergence, our face, what it is, what it has become, how it has unfolded, has grown in that spheric space of the mutual gaze, of the eye-to-eye, face-to-face, interfacial encounter. And that has called forth our face into the shape that it bears. Our face, that's different from any other animal face, has grown like a flower in that hothouse of the mutual face-to-face gaze. When we look at how other animals raise their young, even the closest relatives of the apes, they don't look face-to-face with the infant for long, but the human does. And in doing that, we've called forth over thousands and thousands of years not only the structure of our face evolutionary, but the structure of our soul. I think we've called a particular kind of soul into being through that face-to-face encounter. And I'm thinking that we can think of our practice traditions, our lineages, our spiritual circles as places of, you could say, intensified interfacial encounter, where we're meeting soul to soul in depth with each other. And that is bringing forth new kinds of soul, new kinds of being. And so these are generative enclosures that we've been building, I think, that call forth that, just as the evolutionary, the gaze has done. Well, I'm sure I must be at my time. Anyone have a clue?
It is done.
No? Yeah?
Are you keeping?
I'm at my time. Cool. I didn't get to talk much about generative enclosure as I'm using it uniquely, but all that gives you the idea, and we have a panel, so you can ask me what in the world did you need. Thank you.